The tropical sun burned high over the small Hawaiian airfield, turning every steel surface into a mirror of heat. Captain Thomas "Tom" Weller stood by the edge of the runway, staring at the endless Pacific. The air smelled of oil, salt, and anticipation. He had been an engineer for 5 years, but nothing in Michigan's calm machine shops had prepared him for this. An orderly approached with a sealed envelope. "Orders, sir." Weller broke the wax seal and read silently. His hands tightened on the page. He was being transferred to the South Pacific, Guadalcanal. The mission? Construct operational airfields under combat conditions. Supplies were limited, men exhausted, and the terrain unknown. Behind him, Sergeant Joe Ramirez tossed a wrench onto a crate. "Let me guess, Captain. They want us to build a city out of coconuts this time." Weller managed a dry smile. "Close. They want runways out of nothing." "Then we're the right kind of crazy for the job," Ramirez said. A few yards away, heaps of twisted metal, wrecked aircraft, rusted machinery, shattered fuel drums, waited for a purpose. Weller walked toward them, touching the corroded edges. "If this is what we've got," he muttered, "we'll make it fly." The island wind carried the faint hum of engines from distant bombers. It wasn't just noise, it was the sound of urgency. Somewhere across the ocean, men were dying for the lack of a safe landing strip. Lieutenant Paul Henders approached, clipboard in hand. "Captain, logistics says we're already short on steel matting. They can't ship more for another month." "Then we'll build from what we have," Weller replied. "With what? Scrap metal and prayers?" Weller looked him in the eye. "Sometimes that's enough." That night, as the camp lights flickered, Weller sat outside his tent sketching runway plans by lantern glow. He thought of his father's words from years ago. "Son, anything built by hands can be rebuilt by heart." He folded the drawing, tucked it into his pocket, and gazed toward the dark horizon. Somewhere out there waited an impossible task, and his chance to prove that American grit could turn rust into liftoff. If you love stories of American ingenuity and courage, make sure you're subscribed, because what comes next will show how determination alone can shape the sky. The transport ship crawled through gray waves under a humid dawn. As the coastline of Guadalcanal appeared through mist and smoke, Captain Weller felt the weight of his orders settle like armor. The island was a scar of jungle and mud, littered with wrecks of planes and memories of recent battles. Nothing about it looked ready for construction, let alone flight. When they landed, the air smelled of gunpowder and rot. The first thing Weller saw were Marines digging trenches beside a half-finished airstrip. Shellfire echoed faintly from the hills. Sergeant Ramirez jumped off the ramp, boots sinking into red mud. "Feels like the whole island's sweating," he said, wiping his brow. Lieutenant Henders walked up, his uniform already soaked. "Captain, half the materials never made it off the last barge. We're short on everything: cement, steel, fuel. The supply line's a joke." Weller scanned the shoreline where crates floated near wrecked landing craft. "Then the joke's on us," he said. "We'll use what's here. Salvage everything." They were soon joined by a group of Navy Seabees, loud, confident men who didn't take orders easily. Their leader, Chief Mason, shook Weller's hand with a firm grip. "How you Army boys plan to build airfields or campgrounds?" "Whatever keeps the planes in the sky," Weller answered. Mason smirked. "Then let's see whose method lasts longer, yours or mine." Tension sparked immediately. Arguments over tools, labor, and hierarchy echoed louder than the jungle insects. But every time a Japanese scout plane buzzed overhead, all disputes vanished. Survival reminded them they were on the same side. One night, as rain poured over the tents, Weller heard Ramirez muttering while repairing a bulldozer engine under a tarp. "Sir, this thing's held together by rust and bad faith." "Then keep the faith," Weller said quietly. The following morning, disaster struck. A bombing run hit the coast, destroying the tent that held their original runway plans. Henders stood in disbelief, ashes fluttering between his fingers. "Everything's gone, Captain." Weller's jaw tightened. "Not everything. I remember the layout. We'll draw it again, tonight." As the team worked through the humid darkness, sketching new plans on scraps of paper, thunder rolled across the ocean. Each strike of lightning revealed the men's faces, mud-streaked, exhausted, determined. Weller looked toward the jungle and whispered, "If we can build here, we can build anywhere." The morning heat on Guadalcanal came early, pressing down like a physical weight. Captain Weller wiped the grime from his eyes as he surveyed the field. What had once been a mangled stretch of earth was slowly turning into order, barely. Around him, men scavenged through piles of wreckage, searching for anything that could be reshaped, refitted, or reforged. Sergeant Ramirez kicked at a piece of twisted aluminum. "You sure this junk can hold a plane, sir?" Weller crouched, examining the fragment. "It held one before it crashed, means it can again." Ramirez chuckled wearily. "You always find poetry in scrap." "It's not poetry, Joe. It's survival." By midday, the sound of hammers and makeshift welders filled the camp. Sparks burst in the humid air. The engineers had turned wrecked Japanese fighters into raw material, their metal frames cut into sheets. Old truck axles became rollers, and battered ship hulls were flattened to form panels. The smell of burned fuel and wet earth mixed with the rhythmic clang of determination. Lieutenant Henders watched from a distance, arms crossed. "You're wasting time, Captain. These materials won't last a week under prop thrust." "They don't have to last a week," Weller said. "They just have to last long enough for us to fly." Henders frowned. "You sound like you're gambling with lives." "I'm engineering them a chance." As night fell, the rain began again, steady and cold. The men worked under lanterns covered in wax paper, their faces shadowed and focused. Weller paused to look around. Each man carried exhaustion differently, Ramirez humming to keep rhythm, Henders quietly counting inventory, others cursing under breath, but never stopping. In that dim light, Weller felt something stir in him, a memory of his father's machine shop back in Michigan. The scent of oil, the creak of steel under pressure, the way his father's hands seemed to speak to the metal itself. "There's no such thing as useless," his father had said once, "only unimagined." He ran his palm across the rough surface of a newly flattened panel. "We'll make it work," he murmured. A distant boom echoed from the jungle, shaking the ground. The men froze, listening. Then Ramirez broke the silence. "Guess the Japs don't like our progress." Weller smiled faintly. "Then we must be doing something right." The rain thickened, washing over steel and sweat alike, binding men and metal under one relentless purpose, to build what should have been impossible. The downpour began before dawn, relentless and cold. By sunrise, the entire field had turned into a swamp. Mud swallowed boots, and half the metal panels the men had laid down were sliding out of place. Captain Weller stood ankle-deep in water, staring at the mess that had once been their makeshift runway. Sergeant Ramirez slammed a shovel into the muck. "All that work gone overnight. Maybe the island's trying to tell us something." "It's not the island," Weller said quietly. "It's the rain." "It doesn't care who wins the war." Lieutenant Henders approached, his expression tight. "We can't keep working like this. The steel's rusting faster than we can lay it. The men are exhausted, sick, morale's cracking." Weller's jaw tightened. "We've come too far to stop now." "With what? Hope?" "With will," Weller said. By midday, the rain hadn't let up. The men huddled under torn canvas, tools rusting beside them. The rhythmic sound of water on steel filled the silence, heavy and unending. Weller walked among them, offering what comfort he could, a nod here, a word there. But inside, doubt gnawed at him. Every hour lost felt like failure measured in inches of mud. That evening, Ramirez sat by a fire made from soaked wood, trying to dry a letter. "From my kid sister," he said. "She thinks I'm fixing bridges in paradise." Weller took the damp paper gently, reading the smeared ink. "She's proud of you, Joe." Ramirez shrugged. "She wouldn't be if she saw this." "She would," Weller replied, "because you're still here." As night fell, the rain eased to a whisper. In the quiet, Weller gathered the men. "Tomorrow, we start again," he said. "We dig trenches to drain the water. We weld through the rust. We make this ground hold." Henders frowned. "You really think it'll make a difference?" "It has to," Weller said, "because if we don't believe in what we're building, no one else will." The men exchanged tired glances, then slowly nodded. Ramirez stood gripping his shovel. Guess the runway's not the only thing that needs rebuilding, he muttered. When the first streak of morning light broke through the clouds, Weller looked over the battered field. Steam rose from the wet metal like breath. For the first time in days, the island seemed alive again, resisting but not defeating them. By the fifth week, the runway looked almost whole. Rows of steel panels glinting under the Pacific sun, each one hammered, welded, and prayed over by tired hands. Captain Weller walked its length in silence, his boots ringing against metal. Every panel told a story. A sleepless night, a bruised knuckle, a risk taken and survived. "Think it'll hold?" Ramirez asked, squinting toward the horizon. His voice carried both hope and fear. "It has to," Weller said. "The pilots are counting on us." "Guess that's one way to test engineering. Drop a plane on it." By noon, a single P-38 Lightning waited at the far end of the strip. The pilot, a young lieutenant named Harper, gave a nervous salute. "You sure about this, Captain?" Weller nodded. "She's not perfect, but she'll hold." "Keep her steady," Harper smirked. "That's your department, I just fly." Engines roared, slicing through the thick air. Men stepped back, watching as the fighter raced forward. For a moment, everything held together. Then a jolt rippled across the ground. One of the panels buckled, sending sparks into the air. Harper's plane swerved, wheels bouncing violently before lifting off in a desperate climb. The field fell silent. All eyes turned to Weller. His stomach tightened. "Shut it down," he ordered. "We're not losing anyone over pride." That night, the camp stayed awake under the moonlight. Weller crouched beside the damaged section, running his fingers over the bent metal. "Uneven layering," he muttered. "Too much weight shift near the center." Henders knelt beside him. "Then it's a failure." "No," Weller said firmly. "It's a lesson." He called the men together. "We start over. Every plate gets leveled by hand. I don't care how long it takes." Ramirez groaned. "You mean all of it?" "All of it," Weller said. "We didn't come this far to build something that almost works." Through the night, hammers struck in rhythm with the surf. Sweat mixed with oil, and curses turned into laughter as the men found new energy in their stubborn defiance. By dawn, the runway gleamed, straight, solid, alive. When Harper returned to test it again, no one spoke. The plane thundered forward, wheels clattering against steel. This time it lifted smoothly into the sky. The men erupted, shouting, clapping, throwing helmets into the air. Ramirez grinned. "She flies, Captain." Weller exhaled, smiling faintly. "No, Joe. We fly." Word of Guadalcanal's runway spread faster than any radio signal. Within weeks, new orders arrived. Captain Weller and his men were to move on to Tarawa, where another airstrip was desperately needed. The message was simple: replicate success. But Weller knew success couldn't be replicated. It had to be rebuilt from the ground up. They boarded a transport plane at dawn, engines growling against the wind. As the island of Guadalcanal shrank behind them, Ramirez leaned back with a grin. "Didn't think I'd miss that swamp." "You will," Weller said. "Tarawa's worse." Henders smirked faintly. "Good to know our next paradise comes with a disclaimer." The flight was long and tense. Below, the Pacific stretched endlessly, a patchwork of blue and memory. When they finally landed, Tarawa greeted them with blistering heat and a smell of salt and decay. The beach was littered with debris from recent battles, twisted tanks, abandoned helmets, and the quiet ghosts of men who hadn't left. "Home, sweet home," Ramirez muttered. Weller's tone was steady. "It's not home. It's history waiting to be written." They set up camp near the shoreline, where the sand was firm enough for equipment but close enough to the ocean to draw in every storm. New recruits joined them, young, inexperienced soldiers who looked more like students than builders. Among them stood Corporal Edna Brooks, the first female engineer Weller had worked with. She saluted crisply. "Reporting for duty, sir." Henders raised an eyebrow. "Didn't expect a woman on this assignment." Brooks met his stare without flinching. "Didn't expect to find doubt here either." Ramirez chuckled under his breath. "I like her already." Over the next days, Weller pushed the crew harder than before. They studied the terrain, mapped out elevations, and calculated weight distribution for the steel matting. Supplies were scarce, forcing them to improvise again, melting down old ship parts and welding them into makeshift plates. At night, the men sat around a small fire, their laughter carrying through the humid air. Brooks sketched designs on the back of ration boxes, while Ramirez told stories about Texas sunsets. Weller listened in silence, aware of how each person, veteran or newcomer, held a piece of what made the impossible work. Before turning in, he looked out toward the dark ocean. The waves crashed like distant artillery, rhythmic and certain. "Tomorrow," he whispered, "we start again." The morning they landed on Tarawa, the horizon burned red. Smoke rose from the shattered palms, and the air stank of salt, fuel, and something darker: memory. Captain Weller stepped off the landing craft into sand that still held the heat of battle. Around him the island looked less like land and more like a scar. "Welcome to paradise," Ramirez muttered, scanning the wreckage. "Paradise doesn't usually shoot back," Henders said, pointing to the distant thud of artillery. Within hours, they set to work. There was no waiting for orders. The orders were survival. The first task was clearing the debris of war: shattered vehicles, unexploded shells, the twisted bones of bunkers. Every step felt like walking over ghosts. Corporal Brooks took charge of the welding unit, her voice sharp and steady. "We use everything that's not smoking. Ship hulls, gun shields, engine plates. If it's metal, it's runway." One of the younger recruits hesitated. "Ma'am, that stuff's still hot." "Then wear gloves," she said, sparks already flying. The heat was brutal. Sweat dripped into open cuts. Salt water stung every wound. Weller moved between teams, checking progress while scanning the skies for the next threat. Tarawa wasn't just construction. It was combat with nature and memory alike. By afternoon, they'd managed to clear 200 feet of usable ground. Then the rumble came, distant at first, then louder. "Incoming!" someone yelled. The earth shook as shells exploded near the shoreline. Sand and steel flew through the air. Henders went down hard, hit by shrapnel in the leg. Weller dragged him behind a mound of debris, while Brooks sprinted toward the smoking generator, shielding her face. "If we lose the power, we lose the welders!" she shouted. She pulled a burned cable free and reconnected it with her bare hands. The generator coughed back to life. Ramirez crawled over to Weller. "Sir, she's crazy." Weller glanced toward Brooks, her uniform singed, her expression defiant. "No," he said quietly. "She's what we need." The bombardment faded, leaving the hiss of cooling metal and the uneven rhythm of breathing. The men slowly returned to their stations, shaken but alive. That night, as the ocean wind carried the smell of burnt iron, Weller sat beside the wounded Henders. "You think it's worth it?" Henders asked through clenched teeth. Weller looked toward the half-built runway, glinting in the moonlight. "If one plane lands because of us," he said, "it's worth everything." The next morning, the smell of smoke still clung to the air. The engineers worked through the wreckage of what had survived the shelling, welding with blistered hands and grim resolve. Captain Weller's voice was hoarse from shouting orders, but he refused to stop. Every panel mattered. Every hour counted. By noon, the island's heat turned unbearable. The sun scorched the metal until it shimmered white. Brooks moved among the men, checking weld seams, her sleeves rolled up and face streaked with soot. Ramirez called out, "Careful, Brooks! That plate's still red hot!" She barely looked up. "So am I, Sergeant." A small laugh rippled through the crew, quick, tired, human. For a moment the war felt distant. But then the sound came again, faint and familiar, the drone of enemy bombers. "Air raid!" Henders shouted from his stretcher, propped near the supply tent. The men scattered for cover as the first explosions hit near the shoreline. The ground shook. Fire streaked the sky. A stack of fuel drums ignited, sending flames curling high above the camp. Weller dove behind a sandbag wall, the heat biting through his uniform. His heart pounded as debris rained down. "Ramirez, count the men!" he yelled. "Too much smoke," came the answer. "I can't see them." Through the haze, Weller spotted Brooks near the welding rig, fighting to shut off the fuel line before it could spread to the generator. "Brooks, leave it!" he shouted. She turned, her voice steady but fierce. "If this blows, we lose everything." He wanted to stop her, but he knew she was right. Crawling through ash and grit, he reached her side. Together they cut the fuel line with a rusted blade and shoved the tank into the sandpit. The explosion never came. Only silence, the kind that follows survival. When the smoke cleared, the camp was half in ruins. 3 men were injured, tools scattered, metal melted into jagged waves. Weller sat on the ground, his hands trembling from exhaustion. Brooks dropped beside him, her breathing shallow. "We can't keep doing this," she whispered. Weller stared at the blackened horizon. "We don't have a choice." "Then tell me why," she demanded. He turned to her, eyes fierce despite the fatigue. "Because this runway isn't just steel. It's proof we can't be broken." For the first time she believed him. Weeks turned into months and the war rolled forward like a tide that refused to stop. Captain Weller's team, once a handful of exhausted engineers, had become a force of creation. Island after island they built, repaired and rebuilt, leaving behind the echo of hammers and the shimmer of steel. On Kwajalein the ground was coral, sharp, unyielding. The men's boots shredded within days. "Feels like building on glass," Ramirez grumbled, tossing aside another broken shovel. Weller crouched beside him, running his fingers through the pale grit. "Then we'll make glass fly," he said. Each island carried its own war. On Saipan, malaria swept through the camp. On Tinian, the heat was so fierce that metal warped before it cooled, but still the sound of construction filled the air, measured, rhythmic, unstoppable. Henders, his legs still wrapped from Tarawa, managed logistics with a crutch and a clipboard. "We're short on everything except stubbornness," he said one evening. Brooks smiled faintly. "That's the only thing the enemy can't bomb out of us." Rumors began to spread across the Pacific. Stories of engineers who could build an airfield out of wreckage, who turned battlefields into runways in record time. Pilots called them the Miracle Builders. The name stuck, passed from cockpit to cockpit until it became part of the myth of American progress. Despite the reputation, Weller refused praise. Each success only reminded him of the men they'd lost, the names written quietly at the corner of his maps. At night, when the others slept, he'd trace those letters with his thumb and whisper, "We're still building, boys." On a humid afternoon at Saipan, Brooks approached him as the final panels were bolted into place. "You ever think about what happens after all this?" Weller didn't look up. "After. When the war ends," he paused, tightening a bolt, "then we'll build something that doesn't need to fight." A flight of P-47s roared overhead, the sound shaking the air. One dipped low, its pilot waving a gloved hand. Ramirez laughed, covered in grease. "They trust our work more than their luck now." "Good," Weller said. "Luck runs out, steel holds." That night, the completed runway stretched under a field of stars, glowing faintly from the lanterns placed along its edge. The men stood together in silence, knowing they'd built more than a landing strip. They'd built a path across the Pacific, one island at a time. The orders came stamped with urgency. The new mission was unlike any before. An airfield large enough to launch America's biggest bomber, the B-29 Superfortress. The location, Tinian Island. The blueprint called for 8,000 feet of steel, a stretch of runway long enough to carry the weight of victory. When Weller read the document, he exhaled slowly. "They want a runway for giants," he said. Ramirez whistled. "And they're sending us mice to build it." Brooks looked over the plans. 8,000 feet. We don't even have half the material." "Then we'll find it," Weller said, voice firm. "Same way we always do." The team arrived at Tinian to find nothing but scorched coral and wind. The landscape was stripped bare, every tree shattered by bombing. It felt more like another planet than an island. Yet within hours, Weller's engineers were marking ground, measuring and arguing over elevation lines. Henders, now limping with a cane, studied the map under the blinding sun. "We'll need a miracle to pull this off in time," Weller nodded. "Then let's make one." The first week tested every limit. The ground refused to flatten. Coral cracked their tools. Trucks overheated, welders failed, tempers flared. Brooks devised new reinforcement joints from scrap carrier hulls, welding them into steel grids. Ramirez rigged an old generator to power 3 machines at once. Every solution came at the cost of sleep. One night, as the men worked under a ghostly moon, Weller paused to look at the vast skeletal outline of what would become the runway. He felt pride and fear. "You think they'll ever know what it took?" he asked quietly. Brooks, tightening a bolt beside him, didn't look up. "They'll know when the first plane takes off." Days blended into weeks. The air smelled of salt and hot metal. Sweat turned to salt on skin, and laughter became the only shield against exhaustion. Every evening the Pacific wind carried a strange sound, the hammering of progress. Then one afternoon, command planes circled overhead. A colonel leaned out of a jeep as he arrived on the field. "Captain Weller," he said, "you're not just building a runway. You're building the future of this war." Weller wiped his hands on his uniform and stared down the endless strip of half-laid steel. Then the future better hold. The midday sun over Tinian was merciless. Even in the shade of a supply tent, the heat clung like a second uniform. Weller poured warm water over his face, but it did little to wash away the fatigue or the weight of the deadline creeping closer. Henders limped toward him, holding a stack of reports. "We're behind. Materials running low. If we don't finish before the next wave of bombers arrives, they'll reroute the operation entirely." Weller didn't respond at first. He stared at the runway, now stretching over half a mile. "Then we move faster. We've already pushed them to the edge," Henders said. "One more push and someone breaks, maybe all of them." The words lingered. Weller stepped outside, watching Brooks direct a crew welding support frames scavenged from old tank turrets. Ramirez was covered in grease, coaxing a crane into motion with a wrench and what looked like sheer willpower. He found Brooks later, refueling the generator alone. "You holding up?" he asked. She didn't look at him. "You ever wonder if it's worth it, Captain? This much blood and metal for a runway?" "I've wondered," Weller admitted, "but I keep building anyway." She paused. "And what if they use it for something we don't believe in?" "That's not ours to decide. We're not building bombs. We're building bridges that others will cross." Later, Ramirez collapsed near the mess tent, burning with fever. The medic shook his head. "He needs rest. If we keep going like this, he won't be the last." Weller sat beside Ramirez, whose eyes flickered open. "So you got to finish it, sir," he mumbled. "I don't care if I see it, just make it fly." "I will," Weller whispered. "You've carried more than your share." The next morning, Weller gathered the team. Faces were drawn, uniforms stained with ash and sweat. He looked at them not as soldiers, but as men and women who'd bled through steel for something bigger than orders. "I won't lie," he said. "This is the hardest thing we've ever done, but we're not done yet. We finish it for every man who won't see it fly, for every pilot who needs a safe place to land, for each of you who made the impossible real." No one cheered. They just nodded and went back to work. Because belief didn't need noise. It needed action. The sky over Tinian turned dark without warning. A low hum grew into a roar. Enemy bombers. The camp froze for a breath, then scattered. Alarms blared, metal clanged. The engineers dove for cover, instincts sharpened by months of survival. Explosions lit the coastline. The airfield trembled. Panels ripped from their bolts, sparks raining like ash. Weller ran through the chaos, dodging debris, shouting orders. "Get down!" "Stay away from the fuel lines." A shell burst near the communications tower. The antenna collapsed in a tangle of wires and flame. Weller's heart dropped. Without that tower, the supply ships couldn't coordinate, and if the next delivery missed... Henders, watching from under a steel slab, yelled, "The tower's gone, we've lost contact." Brooks grabbed Weller's arm. "We can't wait. If they lose us, they'll abort everything." Weller didn't hesitate. He sprinted into the open, fire licking at the edges of his uniform. The base of the tower was still intact. He climbed fast, metal scalding his palms. A cable swung loose. He caught it, tied it off, then rewired the transmitter manually with trembling fingers. From below, Henders shouted, "Captain, get down!" Weller ignored him. His focus narrowed to a single point. Signal restored. The light blinked green. The line was alive. As he climbed down, the final wave of bombers passed overhead, distant engines fading into silence. Below, smoke rose from shattered tents, scorched tools and torn earth. The runway miraculously had held. Weller collapsed to one knee. Brooks was at his side in seconds, breathless. "You're insane," she said. "No," he replied, catching his breath, "just desperate." The men gathered slowly, some bleeding, others limping, all silent. The wind carried the bitter scent of burned oil and victory won by inches. Later that evening, as the stars broke through smoke-streaked skies, Weller stood beside Ramirez's cot. The sergeant was weak but conscious. "You climbed the damn tower?" Ramirez rasped. "Had to," Weller said. "You weren't around to stop me." Ramirez smiled faintly. "Should have been me." Weller shook his head. "You already gave more than enough." As quiet settled over the camp, Brooks stood at the edge of the runway, looking out over the steel bones they'd fought to protect. Weller joined her. "We're running low on everything," she said. "Except reasons to finish," he replied, and the two stood together, watching the darkness, knowing tomorrow would bring more than work. It would bring purpose. The final stretch tested them all. The steel stores were nearly gone. What remained was twisted, rusted, and barely usable. But the runway was still a few hundred feet short, and without it, the B-29s wouldn't lift. Weller stood at the edge of the site, staring at the gap like it was a canyon. "We're out of metal," Henders said, approaching with a thin clipboard and a thinner voice. "We're not out of ideas," Weller replied. The team fanned out across the island. Old tank hulls, broken landing craft, artillery shells, they pulled it all in. Ramirez, still weak but stubborn, directed salvage from a stretcher like a general in battle. "Don't waste time on what's bent. We need thick, flat and ugly." Brooks and a small crew built improvised forges from 55-gallon drums and concrete chunks. Flames hissed and flared as scrap was melted down, poured into molds and cooled by hand. The work was brutal. Fingers burned, tempers snapped, but the metal kept coming. At night, the runway glowed orange under torchlight. Men hammered late into the darkness, the rhythm echoing like a slow heartbeat. Rain came and went. No one stopped. No one asked when it would end. On the 5th day, they laid the last panel. It wasn't pretty, mismatched textures, warped edges, but it was solid. Weller stood over it with a wrench in one hand and grease on his face. "She's done," he said quietly. The next morning, the first B-29 taxied into position. It was massive, more than twice the size of the planes they were used to. Its engines rumbled like thunder. The crew gathered silently at the runway's edge, watching with held breath. Brooks stood beside Weller. "If it cracks, it's over." "It won't," he said. The plane roared forward. Wheels clattered over makeshift steel. Engines screamed. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then, lift. The B-29 soared into the sky, clearing the trees with ease. On the ground, no one moved. Then slowly, cheers broke out. Henders dropped his clipboard. Ramirez tried to sit up. Brooks let out a shaky laugh. Weller watched the bomber disappear into the clouds. "We did it," he said. Brooks looked at him. "With scrap?" "With spirit," he answered. The metal was just along for the ride. And on that strip of steel and sweat, they proved that flight wasn't about perfection. It was about perseverance. News of Japan's surrender arrived not with a bang, but with a crackling radio broadcast that interrupted lunch. The voice trembled through static. "The war is over." For a moment, no one moved. Then the silence fractured, cheers erupted, tools dropped, and men embraced with a relief too deep for words. Even Henders let out a long, shaky breath and sat down hard on a crate, overwhelmed. Ramirez grinned from his cot, weak but smiling. "Told you we'd outlive it." Weller stood still, not stunned, reflective. He looked out at the steel runway glinting in the sun, then to the makeshift forges, the scorched tents, the rusted scraps turned into history. Brooks approached, her uniform stained, her hair tied back. "We did it," she said. "No," Weller replied softly. "They did it." We just made sure they had a way home. Over the next days, the base emptied. Planes flew in not for war, but to take men home. Some stayed behind to dismantle equipment. Others simply stood at the runway's edge, unsure how to return to a world that had changed without them. Weller wrote in his journal each night, cataloguing every step of the journey, from Guadalcanal's mud to Tinian's steel. He kept it simple, factual, but on the last page he wrote just one sentence. "We didn't fight with guns. We fought with grit." Henders handed Weller a copy of the final supply manifest. "This is the last load," he said. "They'll be closing the camp soon." Weller nodded. "What about you?" "I've got a ranch in Colorado." "Never thought I'd miss this much noise." "You'll miss the purpose more," Weller said. Brooks found Weller at sunset, standing near the now quiet forge. "Ever think about what comes next?" "All the time." "And?" He smiled faintly. "I think we build. That's what we do." The next morning the team disbanded. Henders boarded the first flight out. Brooks followed hours later, heading toward the mainland. Weller stayed behind until the last crate was packed, the last panel checked. Before leaving, he walked the runway one final time, his boots echoing on steel. At the end, he paused, turned, and saluted the airfield, not as a soldier but as a builder. This wasn't just the end of a war, it was the legacy of everyone who refused to give up. A monument made of rust, sweat, and resilience, and somewhere above, the sound of flight lingered like a promise kept. Decades passed, the island changed, jungle crept back over the land, softening what war had hardened. But the runway remained, cracked, faded, yet standing. An old jeep rattled along the weathered path. Behind the wheel sat Thomas Weller, now grey-haired and quiet-eyed. He hadn't worn a uniform in years, but the posture was still there, straight, deliberate, as if the Pacific sun hadn't aged him, only tempered him. He parked near the overgrown edge of the runway and stepped out, walking slowly along the rusted panels. Grass pushed through the seams, and the ocean breeze carried more birdsong than gunpowder now. A group of local children ran past him, chasing a soccer ball across the open stretch of metal. Their laughter rang through the air. Weller smiled. "Still holding," he whispered. One boy stopped and looked at him. "Mister, what is this place?" Weller knelt, brushing dust from a sun-bleached bolt. This used to be the most important place on the island." The boy tilted his head. "Why?" "Because from here," Weller said, "we helped finish something terrible and begin something better." The child nodded, not fully understanding, and ran to join his friends. Weller watched them for a long time. Later, he sat under a tree with his notebook, the same one he'd carried through the war. He turned to the final page and wrote, "We didn't just build runways. We built a bridge across fear, doubt, and fire, and it held." As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the cracked steel, Weller stood once more at the center of the runway. He didn't need medals. He didn't need statues. This strip of forgotten land was enough. It was never about glory. It was about proving that from scrap and ruin, something enduring could rise. That when people worked together, believed together, they could bend even the hardest metal to their will. He looked up, a plane passing high above, contrail white against the endless blue. Somewhere, someone else was flying, because of what they'd built. He turned, walked back to the jeep, and drove away slowly, the runway behind him disappearing into memory. If stories like this inspire you, of courage, grit, and what Americans can build even in the worst of times, make sure you're subscribed. And don't stop here. Click the next video and keep the story going.